What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into the standard meta now that Meathook Massacre is banned, kind of seeing where people are shifting to, looking at decks that have the highest win rate currently in the meta, even though it's just been a couple days since the ban of Meathook Massacre has gone active in Arena, and kind of see what people are playing in best of one. This is definitely kind of one of those interesting things. Typically when cards get banned in standard, they don't really shake up the meta too much, but as of right now, it does seem like certain things have kind of shifted around. It does seem people have been going towards the more aggressive decks of the format and kind of put in the mid-range decks of the format that were once kind of more towards the top, kind of a little bit lower in the overall win rate category. As you can kind of see here on this page that we're looking at, you see that if we look at the total win rate of decks today, the list is kind of telling of where the meta has shifted in a way, right? Mono white has taken the top spot and when it comes to overall win rate, and that's just of today. That doesn't encompass the last, couple of days of the meta, as this is just a snapshot of what's currently happening. As the recording of this video, this is 2 hours prior to, when the last time this was updated. But as you see here, we have mono white aggro, we have Selesnya Enchantments, we have Gruul Aggro, mono red aggro, and then we have mono black control, which was kind of like the dominant deck of the meta. Now going to that 5 spot, and then you have mono blue tempo, Esper mid-range, and then mono green stompy. So it definitely shows you kind of like how the impact of Meathook Massacre has kind of shifted up the meta in that regard. While at the same time too, it's definitely, it definitely like makes people incentivized to play maybe the more aggressive decks, as I guess a lot of people were trying to go towards the mid-range decks because just how powerful a Meathook Massacre could be. With on top of that, you add on all the spot removal that black has access to, and other decks that would splash black have access to in order to kind of control the battlefield. And you kind of see how that can incentivize people now that the one card that would really wipe out their board kind of is gone, and now they just have to get through all that spot removal. And there's only so much spot removal you could play in a deck, without being able to, with also having to cast other spells to try to win the game. So it definitely shows you that if you can be aggressive in the current meta, at least in the early state, we'll probably look at this in like the next week or two and kind of see where things have kind of settled, just because we still have early data. We haven't really seen 100% what is kind of like the best deck currently, but we definitely have seen how when it comes to a player perspective of where people are thinking. At the same time too, you can kind of see players where they've kind of shifted overall in popularity. Mono red deck is, even though it's not the best deck currently in the format, is become one of the more popular decks. I do think that's just because of budget. You look at mono white aggro being the second most popular, there it being the best deck. Mono blue tempo, very budget friendly, probably the most budget friendly deck of the format. And it's still fairly good, though it does struggle maybe against aggro decks or aggressive decks that put constant pressure on your opponent's life total. Mono black control, because people probably invested a decent amount of rare and mythic wild cards, are still rocking that deck, even though maybe it's not as strong as it once was because Meathook's gone. It's still a relatively strong deck. Selesnya Enchantments is kind of interesting here. It's not as popular, but it's still fairly popular at 6.5% overall in the meta. It's, yet again, depending on what version you play, could be budget friendly, could be a little bit more demanded when it comes to mythic and rare wild cards, but still nonetheless a very decently popular deck. Gruul Aggro kind of slides down right below that. These are all relatively on population. 5% of the meta is still relatively large. Any number here, 10% and above would probably be, crazy of how it is. And if we actually kind of scroll down here when it comes to overall popularity of decks in the format, you can kind of take a look and see where decks have ranked popularity wise. Like it looks here, like for a while in September, right after rotation, mono black hit like a peak of 30.7%. I know it may be a little hard to read, but it was the most played deck of the format. And I do think that's kind of why, when Wizards was looking at mono black and they were looking at what they could do about mono black, because when your meta is kind of shifted in one direction, that means there's something that's too good in that format. But yet again, it's just one of those things that, as a card gets removed from the overall meta, it definitely shakes up how good a deck is. And people find an incentive to play something else because that could be the better overall thing. The other thing too is if you look down here, even though mono black was probably the more popular deck, with the sitting at a win rate of 60.2, you notice that there is this little dip here, roughly around September, in the middle of September, that mono black dips out, and then actually mono white becomes the best overall win rate deck of the format. That's definitely surprising, just because personally, when I was ranking up on the ladder, in the month of September, I don't remember coming across a ton of mono white decks, but mono white actually took to be the best overall win rate deck, and that's even pre-banned, Meathook Massacre, and it's definitely very surprising. I do think a lot of people don't realize and how good mono white is because it's an aggro deck. People are like, well, they're playing a bunch of spot removal, maybe my mono white deck isn't as good. But I do think the fact that your opponent, mono white has access to like Sarah Paragon, which is great against a deck that's heavy in spot removal, definitely makes playing mono white definitely very good. And even here at the end, you kind of notice that for a second, it looked like mono red was actually going to overcome mono black. But still, nonetheless, you kind of see how the meta shifts as people play more games. You definitely get an idea of where the meta goes. But still, nonetheless, this is definitely kind of where I get my information when it comes to trying to figure out what the meta is. And I kind of want to take a look at the website here and kind of take a look at what they consider the tier list overall for, tier 1, tier 2, and so on and so forth. And just kind of look at the top 5 in a little bit more detail to give you guys a better idea of what they consider the top win rate decks in matches played currently in the new, standard season now that we have the ban of Meathook Massacre. So if we take a quick look, the first deck up is mono white. This is currently the best deck. And I just pulled one of the versions because the one thing this website's actually very good at is when you go to a deck and you're looking at, overall, decks when it comes to the particular archetype, it will list you all the versions that currently exist and tell you the breakdown of each game played. And this is actually for the free player, though I think it doesn't pull the data from Mythic. It pulls everything up to, I believe, Platinum, I think is where it stops, and the premium version of it has Diamond and Mythic as well. But still, nonetheless, I just pulled the first version just because it had the highest win rate. But this is kind of like a snapshot of what people are playing when it comes to mono white aggro currently in the format. As you see here, it's a very simple, straightforward deck. It's very mono white. If you've played mono white in the past, nothing too much has really changed. Just we added a couple new cards that we got during rotation, and we have a couple cards I think are just fillers for the time being, just because it's the best thing we got to kind of fill that gap of cards that we lost in the previous format. But if you look here, it's definitely straightforward of what it's trying to do. We have everything in the deck outside of Sarah Paragon costing 3 mana. So Sarah Paragon comes down if something got killed or removed from the battlefield. You can then replay it again with the Sarah Paragon's additional ability, making mono white that much better because you have to get rid of not only the card once, but you have to get rid of that card twice, or have some sort of way to remove things from the graveyard by playing things like Trespasser. As you see here, also the deck has kind of tweaked a little bit, and it plays 1 Valorous Stance, 1 Destroy Evil. I do think that's one of those things that people haven't really landed on what is better currently in the new meta, but still, nonetheless, this is a very solid mono white deck if you're looking to maybe splash into something a little bit more aggressive. And like I said, this version in particular is the highest overall win rate, but I think at the time of recording, I think mono white is sitting at roughly a 59% win rate, which is still relatively good when, 6 out of every 10 games is definitely a good way to, rank up in the meta. Then we look at the next deck up, which I guess they're considering to be the next overperforming deck currently in the meta, and that is Selesnya Enchantments. And yet again, this deck comes in many different versions. There's various versions that are more of in this line where you play a lot of creatures that are enchantment creatures and get, creatures bigger that way. There's the more budget version where you play, a lot of more cards and then benefit from playing Mashako's Reign of Truth and trying to get in for damage that way. But yet again, this is another deck that is performing fairly well in the current meta. This particular version in 1600 matches played is about 60% win rate, which is still very good, and a decent amount of matches played with this particular version. But still, nonetheless, you get the idea here. A deck like this, like I said, plays a lot of small creatures, and still it's susceptible to spot removal. But the fact that decks that would splash black and play like a card like Meathook Massacre, this deck is definitely powerful enough to kind of overcome the fact that those decks now have to replace Meathook Massacre. I do think the one thing that took a little bit for this deck was the fact that it did take a minute or two to really set up your board to the state that your Generous Visitor was pumping up either itself or other creatures on the battlefield. Your Kami of Transcience, another card here. It's a card that takes a little bit of time to build up and build those counters. It's definitely one of those things, and I think Meathook Massacre was just a very good answer for this deck because one Meathook Massacre could really slow you down, especially in the early game, because if they can cast on like turn 4 or turn 5 before you really start popping off, this deck definitely is one of those decks that if you don't do anything about what's happening on the battlefield, it will just overwhelm you, and it'll be too great for you to overcome without having any sort of way to really answer the whole board state. So it's definitely kind of cool to kind of see this deck kind of pop up and kind of become, another good overall deck that's going to perform very well in the overall meta. And I know there's probably a few out there. I think there's definitely, I know one viewer that I see post every now and then. This is kind of, this Selesnya Enchantments has been their deck throughout the standard post rotation. So this is definitely cool to kind of see that deck get a little bit more popular overall. The next deck up is, the Esper Legends deck. This is a deck I covered actually in a previous video. And I do apologize if the camera's in the way. I'll have the deck lists linked down in the description below if you want to check them out yourself. But this is definitely another deck that, never really played Meathook Massacre, didn't really need it. What the idea of this deck is just to play a bunch of legend creatures that are just good in one way or the other. They're all legends. You can only have one copy of them out on the battlefield. And the idea here was just to pump out a lot of things. Your opponent has to kind of deal with the board state, or you eventually just overwhelm them with the powerful legends that you play. You have things like Rafine that makes your creatures bigger whenever you attack. You connive and you draw cards. You discard X cards, and every non-creature card you discard in the process gives your creature +1/+1 counters, which makes creatures very, very big. It looks like it has Shieldred. It has Radavik, which is another very interesting card for the deck. It gives other zombies who control vigilance, and the fact that whenever another legendary creature we control dies, which our deck is exclusively playing legend creatures, we get a token of that creature, except that it's a 2/2 zombie in addition to its other types, and it's not legendary anymore, which is definitely a great card, which definitely makes, playing like legends definitely very incentivized. And I think the only thing is, it really, if you play against a deck that plays Farewell, is probably the only downside to this deck. Every other deck, this deck is definitely very strong against. I actually had a very good win rate in the month of September when I was playing a very similar version of this deck. And like I said, I think the reason is, it's just that all these legends are, it's very rare and mythic heavy for the most part, as outside of this, the only commons I think that are in the deck are the lands, and then the only uncommon here in the actual main deck when it comes to creatures is the Ellis Core, which, this is definitely a good deck. And like I said, it's one of those things that in the current meta, because Meathook's gone, creature-heavy decks are going to thrive in that sense because, your opponent doesn't really have a good way to wipe the board. I think the other removal in the format, the problem is it's a little bit slower to do big damage across the battlefield to make sure you're really destroying everything out on the battlefield. So that's kind of why I think, a deck like Esper Legends is still a deck that will thrive fairly well, even if it played a copy or two of Meathook Massacre in the main deck. The next deck up is going to be Gruul Aggro. This is another one of those decks that, is still performing fairly well. I think it did pretty decent in the pre-ban of Meathook Massacre, but this is a deck that gets better because of that, because, a lot of the creatures that you would play initially on the battlefield, you have things like Ascendant Pack Leader, you have things like Radis Firebrand, small creatures that have small toughness, they don't really have big toughness, and Meathook Massacre, your opponent can Meathook Massacre for 2 or 3 and kind of wipe out your battlefield. And the fact that your opponent has to now play a bunch of spot removal, especially if they're a deck that was normally playing like a Meathook Massacre of, removing the board, you can put a lot of pressure out on the early turns, because a lot of that other, like I said, the other removal in the format is a little bit more on the expensive side, and you really can't discount it any cheaper. This is where a deck like this definitely takes over and definitely could put a lot of pressure out very, very early. You play like a Kamano turn 1, you follow that up with something as simple as a, Radis Firebrand, or you possibly even play a Pack Leader, something like that. Get pressure out on the early turns of the battlefield. You kick like a Yamavaya Ironclast, it becomes a 3/2. If you kick it becomes a 4/3. Getting those early points of damage. You have Squee that produces an additional Goblin on top of the fact that it has haste. You have Reckless Stormseeker that gives target creature +1/+0 and gives it haste until end of turn. If it becomes nighttime, it gives it +2/+0 trample and haste until end of turn. This is definitely a deck that can pump out damage in those early turns, and if your opponent doesn't have enough spot removal, it's definitely a deck that overwhelms you very, very quickly. I think I can't remember which deck I was playing, but I played this deck, and I think I died in like 3. My opponent pretty much had me on the ropes by like turn 3, and there was no way of me getting out of it just because of how aggressive this deck can be if you draw like that perfect hand. So like I said, with all the other decks in the format, that's kind of why I think like a deck like an aggro deck is very popular, especially when a lot of the decks that existed that were more mid-range had an answer for these cheaper decks that had low power creatures, until they really shift and find the answers to deal with a deck that can be very aggressive. It's definitely going to be hard for them to kind of come out of this and still be a very strong deck, especially in this current meta. And the last deck, this is definitely an interesting one. This is kind of one of those things that if you're not going to play the mono black control, you could maybe shift your mono black control deck to more the mono black aggro deck. And what this does here is it just plays a lot of cheap creatures, a lot of creatures that are low to the ground, and it just puts pressure on your opponent that way. The one downside is because it's playing mono black, you don't have access to things like haste. The only thing that would have haste in the battle in this deck would be the Tenacious Underdog if you blitzed it. But that's other than that, everything else in this deck just kind of pops on the battlefield, and you have to just kind of wait a turn in order to really do it. I think Evolve Sleeper is kind of one of those cool cards. You know, it was, I think, a card that you can invest mana into is definitely very good. It's one of those things that in the early turns for 1 additional mana, like after you play it, maybe you play Evolve Sleeper, you slowly level it up, give it a, additional power and toughness. You look at things like Liliana of the Veil is still a very good card. You add it with the cut downs, the Infernal Grass, you have very good removal in this deck. And you also have a lot of pressure that you can put on your opponent too. You get things like Evolve Sleeper, you get Cult Conscript, just a 1 mana 2/1 that comes to battlefield tapped. You can then drop down like a Tainted Adversary or a Tenacious Underdog, follow it up with a Trespasser, or leave mana open to play removal, or play Liliana and make your opponent sacrifice something, or start hitting their hand and making them discard stuff. And then kind of as you kind of build up your battlefield in that way, you then can drop a Shieldred. Now every time your opponent has to draw a card, they lose 2 life. Every time you draw a card, you gain some life. So I do think, if you're going to maybe shift your mono black deck, maybe being a little bit more aggressive with it instead of being a little bit slower controlling is maybe the way to go in this current meta. And like I said, all these decks that I'm kind of showing off, we're still fairly early in the overall new meta post the ban of Meathook Massacre, and this stuff can change, right? As we play more games and people kind of make adjustments to the current decks that they're playing to kind of combat what people are playing outside of the deck they're currently playing, it will kind of maybe shape, and we'll kind of see some decks that were once maybe in the top 5 of overall win rates in the meta maybe get a little bit lower, and maybe something else will come up. I mean, that was kind of like what happened when we first were trying to go post rotation, because we didn't get to really play test the standard pre-release of Dominaria United. We really didn't get an idea of where the power was, and people were really experimenting all over the place. But I think this will probably be solved a little bit quicker than that, because it's only 1 card, and I do think a lot of decks that maybe were once popular, they have to go to something else. And that's one of those things that happens when a card gets banned, right? It doesn't really, you would think that 1 card doesn't really disrupt a lot, but I guess because Meathook Massacre is powerful it kind of disrupted a whole bunch of the things in the meta. And, the aggro decks are now taking advantage of the fact that a lot of the decks that were once powerful, because they had a lot of spot removal plus a Meathook, now are kind of behind a little bit, and they could be aggressive and get out a lot of things. A deck that wasn't here, and a deck that I've kind of been playing, recently, is Selesnya Tokens. That's a deck that's definitely pretty good, because I think a deck like that puts a lot of pressure on a deck like, mono black, because they don't have a way they can deal with a couple of the 1/1s I can put out, but they only have so much removal in the deck, and, having out a bunch of tokens, and your opponent plays a Liliana, you just sacrifice a 1/1 token and keep out maybe your creature. Even if they play an Invoke Despair, you maybe have to sacrifice a Wedded Invitation and a token, but you still are putting all this pressure on your opponent. And a lot of players just haven't really adapted and really found ways to really answer what people are now playing. And you kind of get an idea of some people are still stuck pre-ban of Meathook Massacre, as you'll still see the decks that people were playing before. But at the same time, too, there are players who are shifting, like myself, to something that maybe once wasn't as good, but was okay, and now has become better because of the ban of Meathook Massacre. But let me know that you're playing now currently in the meta, if your deck has shifted from maybe where you once playing, like if you're playing a different deck and now because Meathook Massacre is gone, have you shifted decks? Are you still playing the same deck and are just making adjustments based on what people are playing in the meta? Let me know in the comments below. If you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.